Hello everyone, I want to introduce you guys to the new type of video that I'm going to be making on this channel. It is a disc comparison and I call it the Disc Throwdown. I don't think I should have done that. Alright, in all seriousness, I want to do a quick comparison of two different discs I've long wanted to compare. Innova's Mako, not Mako 3, the original Mako, and Discmania's MD. They're mid-range drivers essentially, and this is going to be a face-off or a shootout between these two discs. I'm going to compare and contrast them. I'm going to throw them about, and you're going to see what these look like in the air, and hopefully not, into too many trees. And hopefully a side benefit of me doing this will allow me to use some B-roll for other videos. But in particular, this bag I'm going to be reviewing in the future, and I'm also going to be doing a review of this Mako 3. This one I got from Infinite Disc, so it's got a unique Viking stamp on it. And then of course, if you have watched previous videos on my channel, you may or may not be aware that I've already done a review of the Discmania MD, so that is what this is going to be. But what we're going to do here today at Northside Church is I'm just going to play a few holes, and I'm going to throw these two discs from point A to point B, from the tee pad of sorts to the basket, and then I'll be doing some additional throws just in a field to show you how these fly in different angles without any sort of challenges or obstruction. Lastly, I will finish up with a comparison and contrast of the specifications and physical characteristics of the disc, and you can kind of see how they compare, and I'll show you some side-by-side and other bits of footage so you can have a better idea of how these two discs compare. Now let's get to throwing down. To make it easier for you to keep track of which disc I'm throwing at which time, I'm always going to throw the Mako first off the tee, followed shortly by the MD. I'm going to try to throw them in the same way, although I'm human and not the highest skilled player, so I may not be able to throw them exactly the same. But I'm going to try to essentially duplicate good lines with these through the woods and through other obstacles, and let's just see how things play out. I will also, as I throw, have a little indicator on screen showing you if it's the Mako or the MD that's being thrown as I go to different lines. I'm going to go by best throw rules, so the best one that I reach, the one that goes the furthest. Alright, let's get to throwing. I'm just going to start out with forehand or sidearm. Maybe 150 on that one. A little bit further, but that's because I got it lower. Let's go to them. Alright, I can already tell you they're not lying when they say point and shoot. These didn't have any unusual fade or unusual turn. I'm going to go ahead and approach towards the basket. These do operate a little overstable as putters or approach discs. But they fly very similarly. Alright, but how do they putt? Pretty good. Also, things like wind and other environmental factors are going to come into play, in addition to human error, so I may not be able to get the exact flight every single time with these discs. Since these are mid-ranges, I can't treat them quite like putters. I've got to throw relatively hard. Given my arm speed, I got to treat these almost like a driver to get them the distance that you might expect to use them as a mid-range. I turned that one. Okay, I find that by going Mako first, I'm making more mistakes up front and correcting with my MD. So that's interfering with my ability to determine which disc is better in which circumstances. That said, I'm going to try the same kind of throw that way. Actually, I'm going to try sidearm given this level of approach. putt with the Mako. See if I can have a lighter touch. That's better. Wow, that was interesting. They both went straight, exhibited a turn. All right, let's see what I can do with an approach. Well, you really have to hyzer them. All right, Mako first. That was an early release on my part. So let's see if I can aim a little bit better. Not shining examples of upshots from me, sorry. Just so you know, this is actually harder than it looks. They definitely act as overstable putters. See how much correction you can do on the second throw? All right, I'm throwing from the first location. These do have a lot of flight to them, a lot of glide. They can actually carry quite a bit. So I have to be careful not to juice it. It's so easy to juice these. The glide is very high on them. And now here are the throws. I spent a few minutes throwing both backhand and then forehand here at this field next to hole 1. And I basically threw both discs, Mako and the MD, hyzer and then straight and then anhyzer, so I can get a better feel as to what these discs will do, you know, when thrown on the same type of flight line, the same, you know, power used, hopefully the same release and angle. And I was pretty satisfied with how they flew in the air. They were not unpredictable. If I threw them up really high, they had a more hyzery type of, flight plan. They did not turn easily, though they did turn when that was the intent and thrown correctly. And they didn't also fade very much towards the end unless I was throwing a relative short distance, such as a putting distance or maybe within 100 feet. But when I threw these correctly, they largely did what I expected. And I actually have more confidence in these discs than I did the dart, which I relied on for the longest time. But these seem to fly more reliably. That may be more due to the Champion and C-Line plastic compared to the DX plastic that I used on the dart. But these fly very similar to each other, and I guess that's to be predicted because, you know, these manufacturers put the time and effort into getting these flight ratings down to some extent to match what they want the discs to do for what they tell the customers that they're going to do. And
I was pretty impressed. When I wanted to throw these straight, they largely held straight, provided that I gave them enough power to go the distance. And you'll see here they don't hyzer out too easily. They don't fade too easily. I mean, they drop nice and controlled. And I was pretty impressed with, I don't know, the level of control. These are control mid-ranges. They're stable, they're straight, and when thrown properly, something it took me, a few minutes to dial in myself, um, they fly predictably. Um, I didn't even notice too much of the difference in terms of how they felt when throwing. If someone just handed me one or the other, I would not have been able to easily determine which one I was given. When you get to different drivers, often the wings can be very dramatically different. With, mid-ranges and putters, the rim thickness and, other aspects of the disc don't seem as different to each other. But as far as the flight, man, these were spot on to where I wanted them to go, and I felt more confident with my throws just by using them. And I think that one could be the backup for the other in a pinch. And I just like how, just even with these anhyzers, they largely do what I want them to do. I can get them around corners just nicely.
Now that that little throw around is over, I want to talk about these two discs. The Mako was certified in 2009, whereas the MD was certified more recently in 2015. The Mako seems to have enjoyed some popularity, but it was overshadowed by other mid-ranges in Innova's extensive lineup, including the Mako 3, which is a more recent disc. And Innova has not really focused as much on producing more Makos, whereas Discmania has made the MD basically a staple disc in their lineup. And there's just less competition within that brand in that smaller lineup of discs that they have. More to the point, it's much easier to get an MD nowadays than it is to get a Mako. So if you want a stable or straight mid-range and you're open to both of these uh, brands. In particular, from Innova, you're looking at like a Coyote, a V-Rock, or a Cobra in their 4-speed lineup, or a Mako 3, Atlas, or a Wombat 3 in their 5-speed lineup. For Discmania, it's pretty straightforward. You pretty much go for their MD, or more recently, their Origin just came out, and it seems to do a lot of this, although I don't currently have one to compare. The Mako has been offered in the following plastic types: Champion, Glow Champion, Metal Flake Champion, Star, Echo Star, and XT plastic. And there are X out variants, or double stamped, etc., or discs with slight flaws of each of those plastic types that have been offered over time, or at least those were available over the 10 or so years, decade or so that the Mako has been produced. And the MD has been offered in the following plastic types: C-line, luster C-line, S-line, their swirly or swirl S-line, as well as D-line, and they have their own X out or double stamped or etc. versions. The slightly flawed exterior versions, but otherwise fly the same and are offered for a discount. So that's pretty good. You can tell that these were offered in the more premium plastic types, with the exception of XT for the Mako and D-line for the MD. It appears to me the most common plastic types that you're ever going to get these discs in are the Champion and C-line plastics, or secondarily the Star and S-line plastics, at least from my research online. As near as I can tell, the Mako will only come out in limited runs, and you have a small number of sites you can get them from, such as Innova's Pro Shop Online or Infinite Discs. I've yet to see them on Amazon anywhere in the last couple of years since I've been looking for them, and other smaller retails just don't get them, or if they do, I've never seen them because maybe it's a very small run and they get snapped up really quickly. But I've never really been able to see this disc in stock. in the last couple years, at least when I visit the sites that I visit. So that's the reason why I grabbed this more recently. But I can get the other Innova brand discs fairly easily, such as the ones that I've listed among others. With the MD, it's often been available. It's rarely out, or if it is out, it's restocked, and that's something you can rely on for this. And that's something that's important in these times with the pandemic, etc., etc. And it's such a mainstay in the Discmania brand that they're so fully behind this mold that sooner or later you can expect to see them again and again and again in stock, and order either your first one, or you can order backups or spares, replacements, etc. Now let's move into the physical differences between these discs. So just to make clear, these are not the same mold. Though if you're blindfolded, it'll probably be hard to tell the differences between them, particularly if they're the same plastic type, regardless of color. But the MD is not a Discmania version of the Mako. That said, these discs are very similar in a lot of ways, and there are differences in only two key areas that I can ascertain. The wing or rim, right? That's this right here, the edge of the disc, or the dome, this part right here. These are the only two areas where you're going to see the wing or rim or the dome. Everything else is going to be very similar. Before I show you the profiles of these discs side by side, via a picture, which is higher detailed and static, so it's easier to tell the differences, I'm going to point out that these two discs I got in the exact same plastic that I could, Sea Lion and Champion, respectively, and they are the exact same weight, and they're the same color because I wanted the competition to be as identical as possible. And while I personally do not believe that color matters in terms of how it flies, feels, etc., how it is shaped, like when it dries, as near as I can tell, when they produce them in the factory, I wanted to see if the looks of the plastics are identical. Even if they do come from the same plant, they may or they may not. As far as I know, all the Innova discs are now produced in California, and maybe they've been forever, but they feel similar, they look very similar, but they are not exactly identical plastic mixes. With this Mako, the Champion plastic is slightly foggy. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see it on camera here so much. Where the MD is just a little more clear and transparent. So this is just a little tiny bit less see-through, but it does not affect the feel of these discs whatsoever. They're equally as grippy. They seem to have the same layer and feel and otherwise, but the very slightly foggy nature of this plastic was noticeable immediately outside the plastic. And it's not a gripe. It looks actually pretty good. There's kind of a nice smoke effect, kind of like an ice effect. Like if this was blue and you saw that smoke effect, you would look at that as more of an icy look that this had. So if you had a blue version of this, this would just look a little bit more like ice, which is pretty cool in my opinion. So this is not a gripe. This is not a differentiator in my opinion. And I don't believe that matters, except if you're extremely picky about looks. And that may have just been with this specific mold. They may have decided to do something slightly different with this plastic blend, or something that's outside my pay grade as far as understanding plastics. But they're the same amount of grip, which I would say is moderately grippy, which I've held and thrown some older Champion plastic, which felt slicker, which I don't know if was a result of the blend itself or was a result of just time and maybe aging and time under the sun, etc., and use. But these are appropriately grippy for what I expect for Champion or Sea Lion plastic. So anyways, now let's talk about the physical characteristics that set these two discs apart, if slightly, because there's no reason in talking about all the similarities, because there are so many. The differences are just two, and those are worth covering, especially in a video this long. First, that wing or rim. The factor that's important here is the wing length, or rim thickness is what they call it. Those are two terms. They mean the exact same thing. Though maybe not apparent, the MD here has a slightly longer wing here or thicker rim. Now in theory that means this is a faster disc. In reality, I think that measurement was determined at the flight plate. So you see the flight plate here? This is further back in space compared to this edge here that where your fingers would first touch, right? So where this touches the flight plate, that measurement to the furthest part out here is 1.4 centimeters. The distance on this Mako is 1.2 from the edge of this flight plate to the edge here. But when you get to where the rubber meets the road, where the wing first touches your hand as you grip it, the distance between this part and this part is identical here and here. So the flight plate is further back, but as you get closer here towards this edge, the distance between here is identical with here. So they're effectively 1.2 centimeters at that area. So that's important to know. So here's a top-down look of these discs on the picture, and you can see that the MD on the right has a slightly thicker rim. However, when you turn the disc over, you can see there is more of a slope on the left from where the rim is at the flight plate to where it tapers off at the edge where your fingers will meet the disc. Where that occurs, the measurement from edge to edge is exactly the same between the two discs. That means when you grip these two discs, they will feel closer to each other than you might think if you read the specifications on the PDGA website or on Infinite Discs or some other website. So the wing length measurements, according to those official specifications, I don't think is as important as it is when you're gripping these two discs, because right now they feel the same. If I were to be blindfolded and you switch these discs around, I couldn't tell the difference between these two just in the way they feel to me. But the reason why the shape of this is different on the interior of the disc as opposed to the exterior, which we're going to talk about shortly, compared to this, which is much flatter, where this is much more angular this way, is as follows. Innova produced a technology, what they call a technology called the plus mold. Now what a plus mold is, it's that angle here between the bottom to the top of the disc here. That diagonal slope is called the plus mold. And some select discs that Innova made, like the T-Bird and some others, Rock and others, they had a plus variant, the T-Bird Plus, the Rock Plus, where in theory it's supposed to fall out of your hand quicker. Like when you release it, it's supposed to come out of your hand easier and quicker, more fluid. I can't really tell. That's not something that I noticed. But that is the technical reason why the plus mold was innovated. It was created to make it come out the hand quicker and easier and with less of an edge. Whereas if you throw most Innova discs, that technology just isn't there. But we're going to touch on that a little bit later. But someone with more skill and better sensitivity might be able to tell that difference in terms of feeling the discs. That said, that plus mold technology that is in the MD is not in the Mako. That's because the Mako, it was produced in September or whatever 2009, and this was produced in 2015, and the plus mold technology was introduced between then. And the MD was produced with the plus mold technology that Innova created, certainly for their discs. And I think personally, as far as the flight, the shape of the exterior portion of the wing, this outside here, is more important for flight than this inside, because the wind is already traveling underneath. So that is not as important as near as I can tell. So it's not going to affect the flight more. And even the drag that's created on this side of the disc, I don't think it matters as much as the wind is sort of funneled out that way. So long story short, that's why I think these can both get away with being considered Speed 4 discs. But if you look at these discs side by side, that's essentially what you're going to notice when you look at the wings. And that said, that design has not hurt MD sales whatsoever. It's still flying off the shelves and is the stable mid-range from Discmania. If you want a stable mid-range, you think MD. This is the middle of the road, straight flying point and shoot disc from MD. And as near as I can tell, nobody cares or even knows about that plus mold innovation that's used in it. And it's certainly a non-factor, and it hasn't hurt. So, you know, that's a difference. But anyways, if you look at them side by side, notice that the Mako on the left is slightly more flat, but angular in terms of the exterior. And I think it reminds me more of the Mako 3 exterior with the MD. So the MD and Mako exterior, so here's a Mako 3 that I've got, and here's the MD. If you look at the exterior of the wing, they are the exact same convex shape, which you're not going to be able to see as well on camera, so my apologies. But something to note, that these have not just the exterior shape, but they also have the interior wing shape, the plus mold. More on that in just a second. The second major difference between the Mako and the MD is the dome. You can probably tell here, but I'll use the picture for as possible. But this Mako is more domey than the MD. The MD is flatter, so that affects the flight characteristics a little bit. So this should be effectively more glidey than this, at least slightly. Maybe not significantly, but somewhat. This is somewhat more domey, so it may have a slight to noticeable effect for maybe a higher level pro. They can throw these a lot farther than I can. But because this is more domey, this has more of a pop top. Let me see if you can hear this. So you hear that heartbeat effect? That is not as reproducible as with the MD. So this is a pop top, and this is more flat. And it is what it is, but I just want you to realize the differences. Now, one thing to keep in mind, there could be a difference in how the mold was created over the years for the Mako and how the mold for the MD was created over the years. But with the two samples that I have of these two discs, this is more domey, the Mako, and this MD is less domey. So it's technically a faster disc in that sense. So that ever so slight difference between the dome, I think would make a difference. This would be maybe arguably more overstable because how that affects the parting line height. But that's beyond my technical ability to explain. But one thing I want to point out is this Mako 3 is even flatter than this MD. So this technically would be even faster than the MD. So this is a Mako 3, and just to show you, I've got a Star MD, and it also is similarly flatter. I'm not going to be able to tell here. But just take my word for it. If it was a flat off contest between these two, this would win hands down. It's a good maybe 2 points of a centimeter lower or more, but this is the flatter disc, and that's something to note. And incidentally, this is a 175, this is a 180. These are close enough to where I can make some comparisons, but the interior and exterior wing shape for both of these discs are identical in every way. Both how they look here, as well as the use of the plus mold technology. Both this Mako 3 and this MD look identical, with the exception of the Mako being a touch flatter. So if the Mako and Mako 3 had a baby, it would be the MD, except that the Mako 3 is a newer disc. The Mako 3 came out in 2017, whereas the MD came out in 2015. So it's like Innova basically said, hey, here's the Mako. Discmania wanted their own stable mid-range. So probably during the R&D of creating the Mako 3, the MD was created for Discmania. I don't understand how all this works, but that's my understanding of how these things are. And then later on, Innova made their own Mako 3, which is just a further evolution of the MD from the Mako. So the Mako evolved into the MD, which evolved into the Mako 3. So I would say, in truth, the MD and the Mako 3 are a lot closer to each other than the Mako and the MD. So if you're very Innova specific over Discmania or Discmania over Innova, I think you would probably want to bag one or the other, or in a pinch you could probably bag them both. Maybe MDs are out, but Mako 3s are in. Get you some backup discs there. You could probably wipe the stamps on both discs, and you would not be able to tell the difference between them, except if you got them side by side and somehow compared dome height, dominess. And that's the only difference I can personally tell looking at the Mako 3 and the MD. So personally, I think this only significant difference between the Mako and the MD in terms of physical characteristics is the dominess, and to a lesser extent the wing shape. Because in my testing, these fly close enough to each other to where you could buy one or the other, but then you'd want to make the dome, and whether or not this plus mold innovation or lack thereof is the factor between those two. But that's on the physical side. Here's some takeaways before I wrap things up. I don't personally care about hand feel, like how this feels in the hand per se, like beaded or non-beaded, the wing shape so much. I'm not that kind of guy. Maybe a higher level pro or amateur player with a lot better skills would be able to come to a decision there. I personally don't care. They feel great. I throw them both. For me, more what matters is looks, and that these just meet the basic criteria. I could take one or the other on any day of the week. If I have them both, it's really hard to tell what I would choose over the other. Regarding the Mako, this has a Viking stamp on it. I actually kind of like it. It's pretty cool. It's a triple foil stamp, and it's part of the triple foil Warriors stamp that Infinite Discs asked Innova to produce for them for their Black Friday sale. That's artwork commissioned for Infinite Discs by Innova, so that's pretty cool. So I have to thank Infinite Discs for getting Innova not just to produce the stamp, which is cool, but to make them on Makos so that I could purchase this disc. Maybe Innova was going to make a run anyways, but regardless, this was great. I really like the way that looks for that disc, and I'm glad that the Makos were available for me to purchase. Regarding this MD, Discmania produced a number of these Team Discmania stamped discs, with a portion of these proceeds going to the Discmania players on their team. So I also think that's cool in its own way. So that is going to do it for my first rather lengthy disc throwdown. These are point and shoot mid-ranges. They basically do what you tell them to do. They have a similar overall flight profile as near as I can tell, and I think you can't go wrong choosing one or the other or even both. And I'm not really here to call, to have a throwdown and not call for a winner. We're not going to have a draw here for this in this shootout, basically. So I have to say that the winner is the Discmania MD. And the big difference maker between these two discs, in my opinion, is availability, not the specifications or the flight ratings. The MD is supposed to be a faster disc based on its design and a little bit less glidey, but to my eye and arm, it's functionally close enough to the Mako, so I don't think that there's a significant difference to most people throwing them. But what is going to be available most of the time, in my opinion, is going to be the MD. Innova just makes run after run after run for Discmania because it's a very popular line. I think it does both companies very well, and I think you're much more likely to get new or replacement MDs over time. And if the rim feel and having the exact disc are a requirement for you, there's no reason to go with the Mako over the MD based on the physical characteristics alone, just in my opinion. That said, there are other differentiating factors. If the MDs are out and the Makos are in stock, you could probably grab some and just toss it in your bag, put one on your wall, whatever. You could just grab one as a replacement or as a brand new disc in its own right. And I think that the Mako will serve you well. I'm personally glad I bought this, and I will be using this from time to time based on the loadouts that I have. Also, stamp design is cool, or maybe a worthy cause that you like. Both of these are pretty good. Or maybe you like, maybe this is out in a blue that you like, or this is out in a purple, or in a swirly star, or a swirly S-line, or whatever, or a metal flake, or whatever. Those are significant factors based on availability that would make you buy one over the other. Lastly, I do have a Discmania MD review that I produced 6 months ago. It's a lot shorter than this, but with a lot more flight footage. And it, I think, is a great supplement to this. I'll have a link to that in the description. I will eventually do a Mako review, and I will put that in this description once that comes out as well. And then Innova, all I have to say is this is a perfectly good mold. Perfectly good mold. I think this would be a great starter set mold. You could make in maybe a DX plastic. I think it could make a return in XT plastic for some people. I learned more about myself than these two discs today in terms of how I throw. And it was eye-opening for me. These are troubleshooting tools. If there's one reason I would sell to you a Mako or an MD, it's that these are great at telling you what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong. Too much ante, the thing's going to turn. Too much hyzer, it's not going to turn. Over and over and over. These probably make good roller discs, but I'm not of sufficient skill to try to demonstrate rollers for this video. All right, that's going to wrap up this extremely lengthy throwdown. I will try to make the future ones shorter, but I wanted to put enough detail on this one so that people could watch a few minutes and get the bulk of what they want, and if they're interested, they could watch more later. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.